next panel discussion is another timely and important one. In this session, we'll learn from different perspectives coming out of the pandemic and how to respond to market challenges with smart post-COVID development strategies. Let's welcome to our stage our panel led by our moderator, Manisha Tank, renowned international broadcaster, as seen on CNN and the BBC. Come on, everyone, let's give them a hand. And our speakers, Josh Chai, partner and head of tax HLB Manjud, and board member and treasurer, Property Funds Association of Australia, along with Stephen Pimley, founding partner and director of Spark Architects, Winston Lee, director of special projects, PropertyGuru Group, and engineer Dr. Zulkifli A. Bakar, managing director of Perunding ZAB, Sendirian Berad.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Yay, thank you. Got some enthusiasm in the front. Okay, I want to find out how enthusiastic you all are about the current Football World Cup. I'm very enthusiastic, though I'm very nervous about England-France. Raise your hand if you've been following the football.
I'm a rugby supporter.
Gosh, there's hardly anyone in the room following the football. So my next question might not be relevant, but I'm going to try anyway. Who is familiar with Metro? Metro. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Over there. So this is all about a chap who's become a viral sensation over in Qatar because he stands there or sits there on a podium all day saying, Metro, and as the fans go past, they say, this way. Now, why am I bringing this up? You think I'm nuts. I know you think this. I'm bringing it up because what's remarkable about what the country has done in the lead up to the World Cup is this very proactive building out of infrastructure. But it's proactive. What we are looking at coming out of the pandemic is reactive. We couldn't have seen this coming. And it's interesting because we've seen a transition from reactive to how that changes our proactive for Asia, what comes next. So that's what I want to bring up, first of all, with all of you. And I'm going to work my way down the panel this way. Stephen, we're going to start with you. Coming out of the pandemic, how is the region doing? And what do you think of this call for more innovation, more creativity? And if we don't have more, how will we survive?
I'm going to start in a slightly different place because, excuse me for that, it won't take very long. I'm not talking about housing. It's not the first time that architects, urbanists, planners, developers, and cities have had to deal with disease. Central Park was built as an open space to help the problem of disease or the spread of disease. Other projects like the centre of Paris, the old medieval city, was demolished by housemen to create more space and better accommodation. The modern movement was set up to bring in daylight as a counter to TB. And London's embankment was built because the river was polluted and the city was diseased because of it. Unfortunately, we haven't learned a lot of those lessons, that cities have been incredibly densified. People live cheek by jowl, as we heard the guy from Hong Kong not so long ago, in Singapore, very successful in its rapid urbanization, but people live very close to each other. And there's not been the investment in open space. That's where I think we needed the innovation, and that's what I thought came out of the pandemic. It was really how people used open space proactively and changed the nature of space proactively. So I was interested in that. Of course, clients say to us, can't you be more innovative? People don't want to touch anything anymore. They don't touch each other. They don't touch the fruit in supermarkets. They don't touch handrails. So I suppose automation is something that we've been asked to look at, changing the nature of planning of residential accommodation to make it more flexible, or changing the nature of commercial office space to make it more flexible, because not a lot of people want to go to work. So that's the sort of questioning that's been put to us as a sort of service provider to our clients, if that helps answer your question. But there are a lot more innovation, but sadly I think we don't learn enough from the problems of history, where the Victorians were doing great things about making space for people to breathe and enjoy space. In Singapore, it's a little bit different because there is a better attitude towards social space, I think, an open space for the public.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived in Hong Kong, and now I live in Singapore, and those attitudes are very different. And we'll hear that it's all very different depending on where you go in the region. No, I really appreciate your view. And with that, I want to segue to you, Winston, because, again, you hail from Singapore, I believe, and there is this different attitude to open space, but there are some people, we've all got an anecdotal story, haven't we? There are some people who say, I love working from home. I want to do more of it. And others will say, get me out of here. I want to be back in the office, and I want to mix with people. I want to come to conferences. So has our reactive changed to a more proactive stance? How do you survive? How do you evolve post-pandemic?
Okay, so I will like to answer your first question. Then after that, I'll deep dive into Singapore experience. So to answer your earlier question about how people creatively maneuver around pandemic, I can think of 2 use cases that I have observed in the early parts of the pandemic. When COVID first outbreak in China in the early days of 2020, most of the developers around the world, they can't really do their project marketing. What the Chinese developer did was they cleverly make use of technology to do live streaming to continue to market and sell their properties to the Chinese buyers. So I think that was a success case where the volume has still maintained at the pre-pandemic level, even though the whole country was locked down. And on the other hand, in PropertyGuru, we used to bring many developers to China to meet the agents, to engage with them pre-pandemic. And during pandemic, because the border was shut, we also convert the whole program into live streaming for our developer to continue to engage the agents. And that was also very successful. So I think the key word here is technology. I think technology can help to break down barriers, can help to break down geographical barriers, can help to break down health barriers. And I believe every company, every individual should creatively think of how they can leverage on technology to break down all these barriers. And I'm also very proud to see a lot of innovation being brought up by the technology team in PropertyGuru, which we can see outside. So to answer your second part, which is specific to Singapore, I think what happens in the pandemic is it's kind of accelerate the digital adoption of the whole nation. So I think in the past, many Singaporeans are still very much using physical cash and all that. I think pandemic actually expedite the adoption of digital banking and digital transfer. And the list goes on and on. And I think pandemic also shows that remote working is possible. It doesn't mean that everybody need to be physically based in the same office to work together. And there's potential opportunity to be unlocked for people to work remotely, and thereby there's some cost savings. And many companies I've seen also take a proactive approach to adopt hybrid working, which I think is working very well in many parts of Singapore. So, yep.
Depends on which industry you're in, though, the hybrid working. On that, I think one of the things that kept me sane during the lockdown in Singapore, and we were very lucky that our lockdown was relatively short compared to some other countries, was I had to go to the studio every day. Otherwise, I would have been with my 3 children, and worse, my husband. It would have driven me crazy. You know, I don't have that story about being stuck in a home. I'm still with my husband very happily. I'm not amongst those divorce stories, I'm very grateful to say. So let's change this narrative a little bit. Something else that we talked about during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic was supply chains. And if you're in the business of, let's say, supplying concrete or sourcing concrete or whatever it might be for developers, you know, you had to innovate, you had to think of new ideas. Have these sorts of things forced us to rethink how we move forward, Zul? Yes, you're up.
Okay. My question to me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the supply chain for every country is unique, but generally, the conventional supply chain will still rule. Because, you see, when developers try to cut costs, they try to do things like prefab or IBS, for example, right? But that would be affected by the supply chain as well, right? Because the conventional method has already established their supply chain, whereas prefab, that is why prefab in this region or even Europe, you know, is difficult to take off, you know, because of supply chain as well. So the conventional supply chain will always rule. That is why when companies try to do IBS or system building, it will going to change the supply chain a little bit. And sometimes it's still affecting that approach. Even though it's a good approach, supply chain still rules. Right? Yeah.
Thank you for that. So we'll transition to something else as we look at this post-COVID situation. Josh, you hail from Melbourne, right? Obviously, we heard a lot in the news about how tough COVID was on Australia. But one of the things that has also come out is just a lot of changes on the political side. And one wonders whether changes in terms of the response on the regulatory side affect things from your perspective. From obviously, you have a tax background, but I wonder what that means for the industry moving forwards.
Yeah, thank you. Simple question. So by way of background, HLB is I'm from HLB International, it's an international accounting firm, and I just wanted to acknowledge my colleagues from 5 neighboring countries. So my perspective is from an advisor point of view. It won't have that PropertyGuru really deep sort of data analytics, but it's quite interesting. Coming here today was great because you felt normal back with people. We could be in 2019, and in 2019 we'd be having this panel, and developers would be sitting there and be pretty much a rinse and repeat. You could have cheap access to financing. Your supply chain was reliable, your products were pretty consistent. Now we're in the spot where, obviously, inflation, interest rates, our team in Melbourne, they're working 3 days in the office. We're built so they can't be in the office every day. There's a lot of change, and the product mix that developers are moving to has changed. But that's, again, similar to a comment before, developers having to evolve is not new. A good developer is someone that actually is just really good at problem solving, and really they have really good people around them, but they will find solutions to the current state. So Melbourne was the world's #1 lockdown city. Who would have thought? Doesn't that make sense? Probably not, but it was. But we worked around it, and so innovation comes in. As businesses, like all of you, I'm sure, have evolved to change how you run your practice day to day with how you have your people coming in. We have clients now evolving into different type of developments. We have clients that have evolved into how they get capital. So, yeah, I'm really interested in this panel to try and unpack more of that.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about the impact of funding models a little bit further down the discussion. So, Zulkifli, I want to speak to you about value engineering. Okay, so this is an area where you are an expert, but help the audience, help us all understand a bit more about value engineering in the Asian context.
Okay, as we've heard this morning from our chairperson talk about value management and save, give example of $1 billion savings, in Saudi. And value engineering is part of value management, where I would like to define it as a systematic and approach, of designing to save costs. But at the same time, we have to meet the safety requirement, the functional requirement, and quality requirement without, compromising these things, and we still can save costs. I've been doing this in Malaysia for the last 30 years. I even won the national low-cost competition, using value engineering. That was back in 1995. And I must say that we can, since the day we started until now, we have improved, our value engineering capabilities, where we can save for high-rise buildings, for developers, even up to 12%, of total construction costs, and for low-rise, to the surprise of most developers, because they think we cannot save so much on low-rise, whereas we can save even higher on low-rise buildings, ranging from 15 to 25%, of total construction costs, depending on the soil condition, right? So I find it interesting that you posed the question, to define value engineering, in the Asian context, because the West have built differently, especially residential. They built differently than the rest of the world. I would say Asia. When I say Asia, I meant people like countries like Africa, going to the Middle East, India, China, right? These areas, they don't build like the West because they build using reinforced concrete. In Asia, we are, I would say, we love reinforced concrete, and the engineers, love reinforced concrete. Whereas in the West, people like North America, not South America, North America, all of Europe, Russia, they built using frameless structure. So value engineering cannot do much in the West because they have removed the expensive part, which is the reinforced concrete element. That contribute to, if a house costs $1, 75 cents go to the reinforced concrete and 25 cents go to the brick wall. And up to 4 or 5-story buildings, we have found out in Malaysia, and I've done it, the rim frame becomes redundant. Meaning in Asia, we have a double structural system where you have the wall, which is called the infill wall, which we ignored. I can't blame the developers because our design practices in Malaysia or Asia, concentrates on reinforced concrete, right? So we have a redundant structural system where we are paying too much for reinforced concrete. So I think value engineering can save a lot, if we build like the West. But in Asia, I tried to remove the reinforced concrete framing, but clients find that, we are removing the structure of the building, So when we say a structure, so we get worried, that the building is not stable, right? So what I did was, we have clients who are very happy if we optimize the structure, where we can save, as I said just now, about 12 to 25%, of total construction cost, which is a lot of money considering now some developers in Malaysia, I don't know about other parts of Asia, is experiencing only about less than 10%, of development profit, right? Okay.
Yeah. So it can be make or break.
Yeah.
Getting that equation right.
So if we can save about 15%,
Yeah. I want to bring Stephen in there.
Can I just say, I really don't like this term, value engineering. I never sit down at my desk in the morning thinking I'm going to design something to save money. I really don't do that. I think that's a corrupting way of thinking about architecture. And I think that's the problem. People think it's about saving money. It's got nothing to do with saving money. Value engineering is about getting the same product by thinking intelligently about how you can deliver exactly the same thing, but do it more inventively. The American engineer Buckminster Fuller said this, that you should try and do more with less. And I think that's absolutely right. In a sort of global society where we have finite resources, we need to put our thinking caps on. Otherwise, we're all buggered. Just like those guys are making bricks out of recycled plastic. That's fantastic. That's value engineering as far as I'm concerned. It's not about rebar reduction. It's not about changing concrete or steelwork. You have to think proactively about delivering buildings in a very different way. Otherwise, too much carbon. We shouldn't be building these buildings.
Absolutely. So I have to keep an eye on time, so I would love to get your reaction, but I'm going to be in trouble. Stephen, let's just extend on that, because my next question to you was actually going to be around creativity and how we make sure, perhaps it's not about saving money, perhaps it's about being more resourceful with what we have. That's what I'm hearing. Give us some examples of some of the things that you've been working on where you're taking that creativity and you're going the next step.
Every project I do.
Of course.
But there is
one that you know of that I certainly have on this piece of paper, and I'm being too much of a prudish Brit to say the words, but I will. The Big Arse Project. Tell us about this.
That's called the Big Arse Toilet. Somebody said to me last week, it's another shit project. Well, it is. I don't have a photograph of it here, so it's very abstract for you guys sitting out there to understand what it is. It's basically a cluster of toilets sitting over a biogas generator, and it's for remote communities in India where there is, I'm sure everybody knows, there's an open defecation problem in India where 200 million people don't have access to toilets. So they take a dump outside their villages, which causes disease. And it's also about the health of the community, and it's sort of protecting women as well. But it's also about giving energy to these communities because they don't have electricity, they don't have water, they don't have sanitation. So this big-ass toilet, basically people take a dump, the shit goes into a collector at the bottom, and it uses biogas to generate energy. It's quite a simple idea, really, and it's a very old idea. It's like taking two very old ideas and putting them together to create something very new, and I think that's what's innovative about it, and that's what I like about the way that we can think about problems like that, going back to the brick guys. You take a problem and you give it a social agenda. I think that's very important to the way, designers can help society, really.
Now, one of the things that's going to make projects like that fly eventually will be funding. On the issue of funding and funding models have evolved post-COVID, right? It used to be the case, you want to get a project off the ground, you go to your bank, you raise the money. But today, there are a plethora of options. How has that changed the scenario? Is that a positive thing?
Well, everybody would want to go to the bank. The bank is the cheapest, it's the safest, it's the most secure. But the world has changed. The level of scrutiny that banks have in Australia, and I believe it's the same around this area as well, is the banks have a lot more requirements on the process to get financing, even if you can get it. So it takes time. So if you're a developer, assuming you've designed something really well, assume that it looks viable on paper, you need to fund it, and you need to do it really quickly. So funding from that perspective there's been a significant shift. To put in context, Asia Pacific has traditionally been very much based on the traditional banking model. In the United States, in 2020, 70% of the funding in general comes from non-bank lenders. 10 years ago, when I worked with developers, they just go to the banks because they can go to the same relationship manager to get the money. In the last 5-6 years, that has changed quite fundamentally. The majority of my clients now will have some access to non-bank lending for some of their projects. And what that means could be that they go to a private equity source rather than a traditional bank. There's an emergence of, and this is in Australia, so it could potentially maybe replicate in Asia Pacific, but we have clients in Australia that have actually built their own, what we call capital arm. So they actually built an investment management arm to get money from investors, which will help put capital into the project and pay a fair return to those investors. So I have a client, listed Malaysian developer, looking to build something 53 stories, and they're looking to set the structure up. So it's getting quite common, and it's a function of innovation, I guess. It really just diversifying risk, diversifying sources.
Yeah, and so in terms of innovation, where do you think that will enable us to be a few years from now? I mean, I'm thinking about things like building information modeling, the more access that we have to data. We've been hearing about that all day. I mean, if you're someone who's a financier, you are going to be thinking about these sorts of things.
Well, it's actually got to the point where, at least in Australia, there's actually so much competition now for non-banks to fund to developers. So I'm actually quite, 6-7 years ago, I'd be trying to get a developer to get funding, maybe from a non-bank lender, and now I've got so many non-bank lenders wanting access to developers. So it's completely changed, and that competition and new products is a good thing in general for the industry, and hopefully then you get a more mature industry and a more stable level of players that do it properly. And innovation also just comes not just from funding, but in Australia, one of our biggest construction companies, ProBuild, went into administration, does multi-billion-dollar projects. So even in that traditional sense, we have clients now, because of the cost escalation, 20% plus of certain costs, they traditionally get it overseas. Now, all of a sudden, some really old Australian industries of manufacturing that was sort of almost redundant have started to prop back up because the security of getting something local like steel is actually important. So everything needs to be reworked. But like I said at the start, developers are basically problem solvers. And I guess what I really like about this forum is that we're having all these people here to try and solve these kind of, work through and sort of work through these issues.
Thank you very much for that, Josh. Now, Winston, you've been waiting very patiently, but I think a fascinating... Thank you, Josh. Don't know what happened to my mic there. Okay, Winston, I want to ask you about China. So we've all witnessed in the news some footage which you could describe as unprecedented scenes in China. Now, does this mean we're about to see a big reopening? So this is a double-barreled question. This is the first thing. And what does that mean for property? Also, fund flows. We know that funds have been flowing in and out. Have those funds gone up, gone down, and where are they going and where are they not going?
Thanks. I'll take your first question first. Yes, you are right. We have seen an unprecedented civil disobedience in China, which was not seen for many years, ever since the last Tiananmen Square incident, where I still remember I was still a student at the time, so I'm still quite young. So, yeah, so I was quite worried that they will start shooting down the young people who demonstrated in the streets of Beijing and Shanghai, but apparently that didn't happen. Instead, what happened was they started to send signal of reopening, where they started to break down all the test center that requires people to do before they go to public transport. So that was actually a positive step. And to answer the second part of your first question, which is how fast do you think China will reopen? I think it depends on three variables. The first set of variables would depend on what is the level of economic pain and psychological pain that the Chinese people are incurring and how much tolerance level they have for it. So the recent incident apparently shows that the Chinese population are reaching a boiling point. Otherwise, normally they won't go out on the streets, even though a lot of them are still very rich. So I think that is one of the key factors. So the more pain they are inflicted and the more they cannot tolerate, and the more there's social disobedience and also you have the social media unhappiness, I think the government will take heed of that and they may accelerate the process of the reopening. The second variable will be more on the health data, meaning to say what is the level of COVID outbreak, and also especially the mortality rate, the death rate. Because one of the biggest issue for China is, unlike Singapore, which actually vaccinate the older people first, they actually vaccinate the older people last. So just to give you some stats, in China today, those old people, which is defined as those with 65 years and above, the vaccination rate is only 65%, which is super low by global standard. So if you have a lot of death rate when you do the reopening process, they may also take 3 steps forward and 2 steps backward in order to control the death rates, because that's what they are most afraid about. And I think the third variable will depend on the level of seriousness of the variant. So we have seen indication that the new variant is getting less and less serious, which then that may also be a plus point for them to reopen. So this combined interaction effect of these 3 variables will determine how fast the Chinese government will reopen the country. Although I'm not that old, but I'm also getting age. Can you repeat your second question?
So it was to come back to, so when that reopening happens, if we're being optimistic,
Okay, sure. Okay.
talk to us about what happens with fund flows. You
Yes,
know, they've
yes.
been going in and out.
Yeah.
What will happen next?
Yes. So I think I'll take your second and third question to collectively. I recall that you are talking about what about developer? What is the opportunity for them, right? So this is where the central theme of today's topic, which is we talk about creativity and innovation and about being able to do things differently, right? So the biggest pain point described to me, the problem statement by the developers is that they want to target Chinese, but China border is locked down. So my response to that is in today's global world, you don't need to target the Chinese by going to China. I think that's a key message. So of course, technology is one way to break down barrier, but the second thing is, but they need to funds flow. Well, in the last 2.5 years, while most of China is locked down and the middle class cannot come to Thailand, and therefore you walk along the street, you don't see it so crowded. But the top 1% to 2% of population have come out together with their funds and family for the last 2.5 years. They are able to do so because these people are the rich business owner who have the ability to apply for business visa, which is very expensive, to come out. And most of them from Hong Kong, from Beijing, Shanghai, most of them land in financial capital like Singapore, because that's where they can park their wealth. And Singapore government has also very comprehensive visa program for people to set up family office there. And because of that, a lot of wealth have landed in Singapore. So to use an unconventional way of thinking, you don't need to go to China to target the rich Chinese. A lot of them have landed in Singapore. So actually your strategy should be to follow the money trail. If you know the money trail is flowing to Singapore, then just follow them to Singapore. We have seen a lot of success of some of our developer clients. We just did one for them last weekend. with a group of Chinese community, and there's one sale happening on the spot, and 4 of them sign up to visit the property. So I think this is how I would size up the opportunity for developer. Before China reopen, follow the money trail to Singapore. After they reopen, then you can reconnect back with the majority of them in China.
I'm just wondering whether you've got a possible tagline that you can pitch to the Singapore Tourism Board. Follow the money. Well, look, I have to wrap up. I have less than 40 seconds, basically to say thank you, but also just a quick whip round. I'm going to put you all on the spot and just say pass if you don't want to do it. But with one word, how would you describe the prospects post-COVID for the property sector? Stephen, let's start with you.
I think it's no change for us at all. It's
Okay.
still doing very well.
We'll give you 2 words then. No change. Winston.
I need 2 words: cautiously optimistic.
Very nice. Like that one. Zul, how about you?
Still good.
Still good? I like how this is going. And Josh, you get the final one.
Adaptive.
Adaptive. Ah, you copycat. And that's minus 2 seconds. Thank you so much for being a glorious audience. Enjoy the Football World Cup, to those of you who are watching. Congratulations to the Socceroos, and enjoy the rugby, Josh. To all of my panelists, thank you. And to the organizers, thank you for having us.